Welcome to the Six Hockey Post-Draft Show. Thomas West alongside Liam Crothers. And Liam, what a draft we saw in the OHL. Some things that we expected to happen, some things that we didn't expect to happen. But we had a lot of fun watching this draft and seeing how things unfolded. What are some of your general reactions to what happened?
Well, in such a unique year, it was a unique draft, a fun couple of days, that's for sure. And it's a great honor for these kids, regardless of if you were picked on the first day or the second day. But it's a brand new start for a lot of these players, and a lot of expectation comes with it. But I'm sure that they've got the mettle to deal with whatever gets thrown their way. A lot of interesting young players we're going to take a look at here.
Yeah, and as we always have through these Six Hockey shows, we're specifically focusing on the GTHL representation in the draft. And Liam, it was a good year for the GTHL in this year's draft. Last year, 66 players drafted from the GTHL. This year, 79 players drafted from the GTHL. Some pretty good numbers.
For sure, and I mean, you can see the difference there. The earliest pick, Ty Nelson from last year. Cameron Allen this year was the earliest GTHL pick. But you look at the separation between the earliest goalie taken, I think that's where the biggest number steps out. About 15 places between when we saw the first goaltender drafted in these past couple of days. And I mean, I think that speaks to the talent level of that player, but we're going to get into who some of those GTHL selections were out of those 70 plus.
Let's do that right now as we take a look at the top 8 players that were selected in this year's draft. Obviously, Joey Costanzo, the goalie that you were referencing. Cameron Allen coming in there as the first pick. What a talent he is.
I mean, a tremendous talent on the back end, and it was interesting that the next player up was a defenseman as well, Tristan Bertucci, and then the goal scorer, Colby Barlow. Maybe slipped a little bit farther than people expected to number 8, Mac Donnell, and then Denver Barkey to the London Knights. I think that's interesting because we've seen the London Knights take a kid who's a little bit smaller, about 5'7", and the same amount of weight. His name is Mitch Marner. He wears number 16 for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Things worked out just fine for him. And Costanzo, you mentioned as well, the first goaltender. It's rare to see a goalie taken as early as Costanzo was, but Niagara clearly had the player that they wanted at that spot available with the second pick in that round that they had possessed, and they decided to use it on Costanzo. And I think we're going to get into why that might have been here in a little bit.
Yeah, and they needed a guy like Joey Costanzo. We talked in a previous show about sometimes you just gotta draft the guy you want at an early time, and Costanzo deserves to be going in that second round. He was a tremendous talent from the last couple of years in the GTHL. Really interesting to see that. Another thing that's kind of interesting is to see how many GTHL players each of these teams pick. So the Niagara Ice Dogs and the North Bay Battalion led the way with 9 GTHL players each. Picking up a lot of that talent from the GTHL, as these are two teams that struggled a little bit in years past, and well, you know, they got to fill some holes on that team. Let's focus on the Ice Dogs right now. Joey Costanzo, that's one of the first players they picked from the GTHL. They needed a goalie, and they got one.
Yeah, and that's partially because of the goal differential that they had suffered. You see a couple defensemen on that board as well, Wyzek, Zingaro, and Mitsis on there as well. And then with one of their last picks, they had ended up taking a goaltender as well. Porperino was the last selection that we had shown you just then. And I think that speaks to how many goals that they gave up a couple of years ago. Niagara was really looking to shore up the back end. Where does that start? It starts with a guy between the pipes because he's making the saves. How do you make his job easier? You put bodies in front of him that are able to stop the puck before they end up in those tough scenarios. And I think from what we had seen between us, there were a lot of talented players that Niagara decided to take coming out of the GTHL.
Yeah, Andrew Wyzek was one of that guy who's going to help out Costanzo. They played a lot of games together in the GTHL. Then they had some guys as well. This was one of the lowest scoring teams as well. They added some players. Connor Haynes was a guy they took pretty early on. Giacomo Martino, what a surprise for him. They filled on the offensive side of things too.
Connor Haynes, a big-bodied playmaker. He was a lot of fun to watch. And Giacomo Martino, 22 goals in the regular season. We really enjoyed watching him play. One of the sleeper picks, I think, that we had thought of in the draft because we assumed he would go higher, but nonetheless, a very good pick for Niagara.
Let's take a look now at the OHL standings, as obviously the London Knights and the Ottawa 67s were very high up in the standings last year, but this draft came down to a lottery, so it didn't really matter where you finished last year. The North Bay Battalion, the Ice Dogs, these were some teams that we saw take a lot of GTHL players. What is the impact of these GTHL players on these teams? Obviously, you know, we saw Costanzo, the Ice Dogs needed a goalie, they took him, but there was other teams that needed other position players as well.
Yeah, and it was interesting that we saw the Ice Dogs and the Battalion used their picks as much as they did in the GTHL. I mean, 9 apiece. That's a lot of players, a lot of talent coming from the league that we had covered. And I mean, what a joy it was to watch some of those players grow in the games that they played. But I think a lot of those kids are going to get the opportunity to play early on because, I mean, if you finish that low in the standings, you probably need some help in some different areas.
Yeah, and that's exactly what they found. Another one was as well as the North Bay Battalion, and we noticed a bit of a trend that the North Bay Battalion had where they were picking Toronto Junior Canadians. They took Sima, Romani, and Malkasian. All 3 of those players are going to North Bay. Now, you don't always make the OHL team right off the bat after getting drafted, but 3 teammates that have a shot to do it.
I mean, line mates as well. I mean, how often is it you see kids who play growing up in junior end up on potentially not only the same team, but the same line? I mean, I can't imagine that it'll be too long before we see them get their opportunity. That might not be in the next year because we'll see if they decide to play in a level down in junior A or if they'll jump right into major junior. Regardless, there are some very talented players that North Bay was able to take there with their 9 GTHL selections. I'm excited to see how they mesh.
Yeah, there's a theme there as well. They're picking from one of the top teams in the GTHL, and those players are coming right over to the battalion, and we'll see if that strategy works. It seems logical for sure. We take a look at some of the goalies now selected. Now, Joey Costanzo was the number 1 goalie, and it was a battle. It was going to be between him or Mason Vicari. Costanzo wins that battle, gets drafted before Mason Vicari. But either way, Vicari going to the Kingston Frontenacs, that's a team with some goalies that are starting to age out. He could slip in and be a valuable asset.
Yeah, and I can't say that the top 4 in the goaltenders that we saw surprised us all that much, but it was interesting to see the right-handed catching Ethan Simpson go before Josh Branton, the netminder for the Toronto Junior Canadians. We saw him and Antonino Rizzo split time, and I mean, we had talked about it a lot that it was going to come down to the difference between Costanzo and Vicari. I think it was a little bit surprising to see Costanzo go so far ahead of Vicari. I'm not sure if the separation was there in terms of talent. They're both very good goaltenders, but Niagara had the men they wanted at their pick, and they decided to go with it.
As we take a look now at some of the dual draftees, so players that are going to 2 teams. They got drafted in the USHL, and they also got drafted in the OHL. Now, you can't play in both leagues. They got to pick one, and it becomes so interesting when things like this happen. We'll start off here with Carson Rakop, a guy who went 17th overall in the OHL and then 12th overall in the USHL. So both teams that drafted him are really trying to vie for him to go to their league.
And I think that's where you see the least separation because you see Pinelli very early in the OHL, not so much in the UHL. The same thing for Lulkin. Poitras a little bit closer in terms of OHL and USHL selection, but from there, Martino and Cameron Briere, you could see the separation between the USHL and the OHL. I think that it might have something to do with the fact that if you're drafted in the USHL and you play there, you still maintain NCAA eligibility. That's a path that we've seen a lot of players take. However, if you're playing in the OHL, you're not allowed to participate in the NCAA. However, you are allowed to go the U Sports route. And there's a lot of talented hockey programs in the U Sports camp. I mean, there's just a ton of talent there. We've seen so many OHL players go that route. It'll be interesting to see how these kids decide to shape their future.
Yeah, so what does this say exactly about these players? Obviously, we saw Cameron Briere go to the USHL at pick number 24. He was way down in the OHL. Does that suggest that maybe there's a better chance that a guy like Cameron Briere or maybe even Giacomo Martino decides to go that route?
Well, it's entirely possible, and I think that comes from, well, Cameron Briere did play was signed up for the Nashville Junior Predators, and from the year that we were seeing, he was in the GTHL, but that might have something to do with it. And I mean, there's a ton of options for these kids out there. There's so many different avenues that they can decide to take, but you know, the decision doesn't come right now. We're sort of in the process of them absorbing what has happened over the past couple of days. There's a lot of excitement to be had for those players, but we saw from some of those late round picks in the OHL, I think there's a lot of talent that was left on the board.
Yeah, and your options really open up when you are as talented as some of those players are. We take a look at some picks now that have some late round value. They're not necessarily guys that are, went in the top round. Giacomo Martino was a guy that really came to mind for me. This is a guy who led the Vaughan Kings in goals, and he's going to a team, and the Ice Dogs, who we mentioned were the second worst in the OHL last year in scoring goals. Well, that's exactly what Giacomo Martino does. 22 goals last year, didn't have a ton of assists, but the Niagara Ice Dogs need a goal scorer, and who better to pick than from a team that was really good in the Vaughan Kings, and this was a guy who could find the back of the net.
Yeah, and maybe going out on a limb based on where we saw him go in the USHL, but if he does end up playing for Niagara, they are going to be very happy with the player they got.
Yeah, and if he can make that team, he brings the attribute that's exactly what they need. Now, Finn Harding, another guy who you thought had quite a bit of value in the late round.
I thought so, and I thought the consensus was amongst the Toronto Junior Canadiens team that he was the best defenseman available there, but selected 8th round, 181st overall, to a team in the OHL that in 2019-20 had one right-hand shot defenseman. Finn Harding at 6'1", 175 pounds, is a tremendous defensive prospect that fills that hole.
Yeah, and this is a guy who, he's got a little bit of size as well. We saw there he was listed at 6'1". When we were watching his games, he's definitely growing since then. So that is definitely a big attribute for him, being able to step up with that team. Really looking forward to seeing Finn Harding play. And a guy who we saw step up into the offense a little bit as well.
Yeah, definitely has that offensive touch that he's able to contribute with. We'll see how far that gets him with the Steelheads coming up here in a couple of years.
Well, it was amazing watching this draft, and it was a lot of fun seeing where all of these players went, the people that we got a chance to look at. We appreciate you tuning in to the post-draft show from the Six Hockey. Thomas West and Liam Crothers. See you next time.